to all that really clearly. Well, I stand clearly with Donald Judd on this, is that thought and feeling are two exactly, they're just complementary aspects of something. They're not two different things, and that you can't take them apart. You can't say, in college I invented the word poetechnical because I'm always trying to reconcile art and science in some way, and I think that's where, sure, it has served us really well to take life apart in that way and look through two different kinds of lenses at it, but architecture, because it involves structure of everything that we do in a literal way, whether at an urban scale or your house, you especially can't. You need a telescope, you need a microscope, you need to be able to see it at a whole lot of different levels, and I think it's problematic to pretend that you can only put on one kind of filter and look at architecture and see it for what it is. What something smells like when you walk in the west portico of the Kimball and you're walking on gravel and listening to the water and you're standing in the Opons in the West Texas sun, it would be foolish to take one piece of that apart and say that's the important part of it somehow. All those things are really one thing, and just like that line between furniture and interior work and the building itself and the landscape and so on to the Bauhaus, that was clear that there's no real transition between any of those things. It's an artificial distinction, and so it has served the business world fairly well to break things up that way and say this is this and this is that and name it in a certain way. The reality of it is, at the end of the day, and you have to take a building apart, you have to describe this piece of the building is done this way, this piece of the building is something else, and you have to work with different trades to bring it all together. But the test is, at the end of the day, and the dust settles, and as Lucan would say, the grass grows again around its feet. The building doesn't know any of those things. You just go about your life, and it either carries those qualities or it doesn't, and that's the test. And I think that's where Howard's and the intimacy, the scale is always right, which is partly sensibility about materials. It's partly understanding geometry and how geometry relates to life. Some of it's luck. Scale's a really tough thing to pin down, but he had a particular capacity for being able to get things right at all those levels at the same time, to orchestrate. Kahn would say that really the role of an architect is in composition, is as a composer, and you get hung up in the day-to-day with all the different aspects, and you forget how many pieces a building can actually have to try to assemble. But in the end, all that goes away, and it either works or it didn't. And I think that when you walk into a space, whether somebody cared about it or not, is just immediately evident. And you might not know who Howard Meyer was, but you would know when you walk into one of his buildings that something's going on here, that somebody cared about it and somebody knew what they were doing. And then you'd find out who he was. It would cause you to want to know who that person was and why it had those qualities. I think the best work is always like that. I've lived my whole life against category, against that notion of style. So while it's a handy tool to a certain point, it also misses. Generally, if you're associated with a particular style, you probably during your life would have argued that you had nothing to do with that, or that all the other people that are in that same box, that you had absolutely nothing to do with all those other people. And so it's a kind of irritation while you're alive, and you can't control it when you're gone. So maybe I'm railing against something that you can't fix, but but I don't believe in that. I believe that the real issues in life transcend all that, and that Howard's work, this is what we mean by timeless, is that if it addresses all those issues and it addresses them with the materials at hand at that moment, good luck trying to use materials from 100 years ago anyway. I mean, it's not really in the true sense of the word, you can't do it anyway. So an architect would be able to look at one of Howard's buildings or one of anybody's buildings, and within a few minutes pin down within a couple of years when it had been built. You can't hide that, and that doesn't say anything about whether you walk in the building and know that there's something that's truly human and of enduring quality to it. It's just to say that sooner or later a little detail will give it away and place it in time. There are certain curves you can look at, and you can date a curve down to about a 20-minute time slot. Life doesn't change that much in a certain way. There's the circumstantial things move on, but basically, like the usual metaphor is the design of a chair. The design of a chair still addresses the exact same things it addressed for the Egyptians, and there was a period where we didn't have chairs prior to that, but once you have that idea of sitting down at a certain level, look at how many multitudes of different designs you can make for a chair, but the idea chair is still basically the same thing. And architecture is sort of that same way again. There's life on Earth by human beings who walk, and the materials at hand change a little bit. They're changing pretty quickly right now with composite and hybrid sorts of things, but if you go back for the majority of mankind's existence in stone and wood and so on, daylight as a material, that those don't really change. And so it's constantly trying to reconcile those things that are true of life over time with those things that are just of the moment. And I wouldn't say fashion, but I would say availabilities at a certain place at a certain time. And that's really the architect's role, I think, is to do that. And it's in a funny way, it's a kind of comment on, we make fun of McMansions in Texas and people's tastes and trying to bring Georgian colonial or whatever to bring classical work into a place where it basically shouldn't exist at all. And I think, at least my take on that, is that it's a kind of a funny backhanded compliment about architecture, that we want architecture to have that sense of time, to carry that kind of weight for us. We just get it wrong. We want it to look like that also, which is the problem. It shouldn't look like those buildings. But I think absolutely architecture should carry those things. And it's just kind of a misplaced concern. And again, beginning with what something looks like as opposed to what it actually is, which is the harder thing to see sometimes, to look through the surface of things. And it's that quality I think an architect develops. If he didn't have it to begin with, he develops it over time, to be able to see through the surface of a thing and be able to try to get at the real deeper issues in it. And beyond that, that architecture, really, a building, let's say, is an instrument, and it's like a piano. You can make a really lovely, you make a beautiful piano, but that's sort of meaningless until somebody sits down at the piano to play it. You made a really beautiful instrument, but it's still just an instrument standing there in the room. And I think buildings are that way as well. You can make a really beautiful building and it can stand out in the weather and so on, but until human beings occupy it and it's actually you doing whatever it is that it's supposed to do, that's where it matters. That's what the real test of anything is, architecturally. Well, I think students are usually wrong about a lot of things, but one of them is a short-sightedness that presumes that there's a shortcut through things, that if they just follow a certain narrative through life, then they'll have learned it, and then they're done, and then they can move on and make money and whatever. And it comes from all sorts of cultural issues here in America, but, or at least the American version of it comes from those things. That whole idea of a career, for one, is part of it, but also an assumption that there's a shortcut. So I think if a real student knows that nothing is simple and you can't oversimplify things like that, you can't say that this is important and this isn't, that you have to be more careful and more fragile about that analysis of things. And if you had a bad teacher, for example, they would just say, well, there's nothing in Texas worth talking about architecturally, and just skip the entire topic. And it usually, to me, that's an indication of just how bad the teacher is, that they know nothing about that, about their own topic, let's say. So it's hard for a student to first figure that out, that they need, or should, I think, watch. You almost start with the footnotes. You start with all the small things and sort of watch how they accrue, and don't make quick judgments about things. you can make a certain kind of progress, and this is the history of the Western world, to have either or kind of conversations and say this as opposed to that and move forward, and you make, it has served us well at a point, but life isn't like that, and there's gray areas between all those things. And I think that as a student, you'll be presented constantly with those sorts of either or propositions, and this is important and that's not important. And I think you have to, you hear it, but you take it with a grain of salt. And so there's, I guess what I'm getting at is that there's a tendency to take certain kinds of work and just say either it's in that blind spot of a several decades ago where it just isn't interesting at the moment. And immediately you're wrong, because those things come out the backside of that as being really terribly important things to know about. If you cared about Rem Koolhaas today, the only reason you care about him is because he went back and looked at work in 1950s New York, which no one cared about at the time, to write Delirious New York. And so it's, find the architect that you care about, and you'd be very surprised about who they, or what work they actually are most interested in. Bob Venturi would say that Mies was the best architect that had lived. And you, on the surface of things, in a million years, you would never guess such a comment coming out of Bob's mouth. But as you come to look at things and see through all that, you would understand what he's saying about it. So I think the tendency is to try to write off architects in that you might not have seen on the front page of a magazine in the past 20 years and say that their work isn't significant. But if you went to the architects you are seeing on the front page of the magazine right now and said, who do you care about? And then they start talking about Howard Meyer, you shouldn't be surprised that that's what makes them good architects, is that they're paying attention to the to their predecessors, to the people that were the first people to walk that ground, let's say, to come to that problem. I've always loved Picasso, before he died, said that when he died, painting would have to go through him because it couldn't go around him. And he basically touched everything in painting that could be touched and left the argument on the table. And I think of Lou Kahn that way. I think any architect who's really good, that as a practicing architect, when you'll come to a certain issue, they've beat you to it. They've left the benchmark for what that solution might be. And if you look at very quiet, intimate, beautiful residential work, for example, in Dallas, there's 2 or 3 people that have left quite the benchmark for that. You better be pretty good, or you're not gonna, or you're kidding yourself if you write them off and say that person's work isn't worth looking at. You'll just be proved wrong. You may be 80 when it happens, or you may be dead when it happens, but you'll be wrong. That Howard is one of those people who, if you care about life, if you care about architecture, you care about Dallas, you care about work of that time period at all, Howard's work is going to endure and speak to you as long as these houses are here. We've lost, the loss of the Zale house was an enormous travesty to that. The people that wanted it for just the property to build a Spanish house, whatever, really took away a beautiful piece out of that conversation. If I brought an architect here from Europe as one of the tours I give frequently or whatever, I can show them one of Howard's projects, and they know it from this. I mean, they get it. Those are the things about architecture that transcend any place or time or whatever. That there's an admiration for that's worldwide. That really, I think, is what architecture is about, and about that conversation of quality and so on. The work either has it or it doesn't, and you can kid yourself about it for a while, but sooner or later, the Texas put up or shut up sort of appears, and you either know what you're doing, or strangely, there's plenty of architects who are just practicing without any kind of self-awareness at all about their time and place, and they're kidding themselves because, again, as an artifact, the building carries that, whether you even know it yourself. It's there, and other people see it.